The West has fallen. Britannia was abandoned centuries ago. Gaul is overrun by the Franks. Hispania is a Visigothic province now, and North Africa has fallen to the Vandals. Worst of all, Italy, and thus Rome itself, has become an Ostrogothic kingdom. Only the East still stands. But even in the East, Huns and Bulgars press in on the north, and in the south, war rages with the mighty Sassanid Empire. Not even Anatolia, the heart of the empire, home of Constantinople herself, is safe. And yet today, all around us, we see the legacy of Eastern Rome. In the heart of Istanbul stands the Hagia Sophia. Its great domes housed the largest cathedral in the world for 1,000 years, and even now, 1,500 years after its construction, it stands as a wonder for us all. Every day in courtrooms half the world over, decisions are made rooted in the legal framework laid out in the Corpus Juris Civilis. And in the apse of the Basilica in San Vitale, if you look up, you will see the most renowned emperor of the East looking down on you from a mosaic nearly 1,500 years old. And these things that are left to us are almost all the work of one man, one emperor, Justinian. He was perhaps the greatest emperor of the Byzantines, and the last of them to dream of a restored Rome, to dream of a unified Christian church, to dream in marble and gold and steel. Never again would the Roman Empire see the heights it saw under this one man, and never again would anyone come so close to bringing the West back into the light of Rome. But Justinian's legacy is mixed. Unlike those heroic emperors who kept Rome and then Byzantium from being forever extinguished when complete collapse looked inevitable, Justinian took an empire that was beset on all sides but still strong and raised it to magnificence. But in doing so, he may have gambled too many of its resources, expended too much of its strength on a dream. Justinian is one of my favorite Roman emperors because he had the boldness to dream in a way that no one else did, and he had the energy, the drive, and the capacity to back up those dreams. He was intelligent, wise, diligent beyond measure, working tirelessly for his people, but his reign was not without blood, not without miscalculations, and not without human failings and distrust. And so for the next few weeks, we'll dive into the reign of this most spectacular emperor, and his renowned empress, Theodora. Justinian bursts into a flurry of action, nearly unparalleled in history. He reformed almost every aspect of the empire, trying to fix 1,000 years of bureaucracy and neglect. But he didn't do it alone. He elevated a cast of some of the most talented, most diligent men in the history of the empire to attack all the things he saw wrong with the Imperium. Unfortunately, these brilliant, hard-working servants of the empire were also some of the most corrupt, quirky, and colorful characters the empire would ever see. So today, we're just going to work through Justinian's reforms by introducing you to these characters and what they did. First off, Justinian was a big spender. He wanted to build up the military, increase infrastructure, create monumental public works, and throw lavish games. But to do all this, he needed coin. And one of the problems the Roman Empire struggled with from its inception, one of the problems that helped bring down the West and had almost brought down the East, was tax collection. The rich would avoid their taxes, and the poor couldn't pay. And this just would not fly for Justinian. So he brought in John the Cappadocian. I mean, he even sounds like a mobster, doesn't he? This guy, John the Cappadocian, totally overhauled the tax system in the empire. He moved tax collection out of the hands of local officials. He crushed corruption within the ranks of the tax collectors, and one of his less popular reforms, at least with some segments of society, was torturing rich people until they paid their taxes. Of course, he was also a debauched glutton who skimmed from the taxes to feed his own perversions. Reports abound of his greed, his sexual appetite, and his boorish, slave-like treatment of his staff. Now, of course, many of these are exaggerations. After all, nobody likes the tax man, and being a more efficient tax collector probably isn't going to win you a glorious place in contemporary histories. But there are enough of these reports that I think we can assume this guy was likely running a very whistle-clean tax administration while shaking people down and engaging in some Baron Harkonnen-like good times himself. With the money he needed taken well care of, Justinian also attacked the second problem of the empire, the legal code. For 1,000 years, laws had been added, changed, and overturned without anybody really collating them, rationalizing them, or really putting them together in any way that wasn't contradictory. At this point, a lot of them just plain didn't make sense. This meant that the law courts had become clogged, corruption was rampant, and justice through the legal system was simply not available for most people. Justinian planned to end this, and so he brought in Tribonian. Tribonian was one of the most brilliant legal minds of all time. In 14 months, he untangled a millennium of Roman law and had a new law code ready to publish. Then he compressed 1,500 existing books of legal decisions down to a mere 50-book set, making the law comprehensible and approachable. With Justinian's help, he then had these books ruled to supersede all previous legal decisions, so that all lawyers and judges were working from the same law. He rounded out these mind-boggling feats by writing an accessible textbook for all future lawyers to learn from, and together, these books form the Corpus Juris Civilis, the work that today's civil law is founded on. Of course, Tribonian was also an unabashed pagan, throwing sacrilegious parties and feasts even as Justinian was ostensibly cracking down on paganism. He was also utterly corrupt, or as one author once put it, every day he repealed or enacted some law at the instance of people who purchased this from him. Otherwise, of course, he was known for being good-natured, diplomatic, and only a little bit of a fop. With the Herculean task of reforming the entire canon of Roman law safely in the hands of perhaps the only man in history who might actually be up to the challenge, Justinian could finally turn his eye on military affairs. Justinian dreamed of reconquering the West, of reuniting and recreating an empire that had only fallen some 50 years before. He dreamed of restoring Rome. But at the time, the Romans were being kicked around by the Sassanid Persians all across the southern half of the empire. Before Justinian could turn his eye west, he had to stop the Persians from taking over what empire there was left. And for this, he had one of the best generals history has ever produced. A man easily the rival of Napoleon or Alexander, though his name's not so well known. A man named Belisarius. From an early age, Justinian recognized this man's brilliance, and by the time Belisarius was 25, he was Magister Militum, or theater commander of the East. But to talk about Belisarius, Theodora, Empress of Rome, looked at the trembling men around her, counseling her husband to flee, and said, "Whether or not a woman should give an example of courage to men is neither here nor there. At a moment of desperate danger, one must do what one can. I think that flight, even if it brings us to safety, is not in our interest. Every man born to see the light of day must die, but that one who has been emperor should become an exile I cannot bear. May I never be without the purple I wear, nor live to see the day when men do not call me your majesty. If you wish safety, my lord, that is an easy matter. We are rich, and there is the sea, and yonder our ships. But consider whether if you reach safety, you may not desire to exchange that safety for death. As for me, I like the old saying, that the purple is the noblest shroud." There was a silence in the hall, and shame. Then Justinian said, "Get me Belisarius, Mundus, and Narses." While the palace guards had not been enough to quell the riots, as luck would have it, Belisarius, Justinian's greatest general, happened to be in the city waiting to be reassigned, and Mundus, the great Germanic general who had long defended the empire's northern frontier, was also passing through the city on his way to take up Belisarius's old post. Neither of them had their armies with them, but they did have their personal legions. At Justinian's command, they gathered their men. The last man Justinian gathered, Narses, was a deceptively frail man, a thin Armenian eunuch serving in the palace. Justinian trusted Narses. Narses was his master of the treasury, and as a eunuch, Narses could never become emperor, so Justinian could ask Narses to do the very thing that had allowed his family to usurp the throne in the first place. Take a big bag of money, slip out of the palace, and bribe those opposing him. Narses made his way to the Hippodrome, unnoticed, quietly following the stair that took him to the box where the leaders of the Blues stood as the crowd shouted and cheered for Hypatius. Narses reminded them that Justinian favored the Blues, and you know that Hypatius guy's a green, right? Before putting a small stack of gold in each of their hands. Soon after, members of the Blues started to silently disperse. But the Hippodrome was still filled with tens of thousands of Blues and Greens milling about the arena floor. Belisarius planned a commando raid to snatch Hypatius and flee, but he found the way blocked, so the order was given. Belisarius and his men entered from the east, while Mundus entered from the west. They marched in a line, cutting down all before them. People panicked and fled, clambered over each other, were trampled as they ran, but impassive, the soldiers marched on. By the end of the day, 30,000 people lay dead in the Hippodrome, and Justinian's reign would never be challenged again.